Welcome everyone to another episode of the Shaman's Way podcast. As always, this episode comes from the teachings of our amazing friend and shaman in residence, Kriket. We hope you're enjoying these podcasts as much as we enjoy making them, and I'd like to take just a moment to ask you if you would please leave us a rating and a comment in iTunes or whichever podcast player you're listening to us from. Giving us a rating and sharing this podcast with others is the biggest way you can tell us that you like our show. Now, without further ado, on with the episode.
Well, hello, my constant listeners, and welcome back to Shaman's Way. So, to my constant listeners, some of you know this voice. Her name is Patti, and she is the caretaker, the creator, the maintainer of the Edmonton Drumming Circle. To my semi-constant listeners, you may have heard me reference her in past conversations. And to my brand new listeners, well, welcome. My name is Kriket, and I am sitting here with an old friend and a lovely lady by the name of Patti, who runs a drumming circle. Today, what we are going to chat about is how to create a drumming circle. One of the things that we often run across as solitary practitioners is that it can also be as comforting as it can be to practice alone. It can be also encouraging to practice with others. Some of us are procrastinators. I know none of my listeners have ever procrastinated about everything because I know you're all perfect. But I myself do procrastinate here and there. Yes, you've heard it. It's true. That's my truth. So what we wanted to talk about was I led the drumming circle for a number of years. I inherited it from a gentleman who no longer wished to do it. He was a former teacher of mine. He had been drumming probably maybe 5 or 6 years before I came on board. And when I turned 30, after I'd been in the circle for 3 years, is when he turned the circle over to me. And we had a fairly large drumming circle by that point in time. When I started, many of my constant listeners know that, and even my semi-constant listeners, that I started off in the basement of the Stan Daniels Center, and that it was a place that I kind of got my teeth sunk into, so to speak. And so from there, we went to the attic of a big school. We outgrew that very quickly. And then we moved into a gymnasium of the same school. And every Friday night, we had a drumming circle that had anywhere between 40 and 45 people. So we saw many people through the years that we had been going through that. Then as things happen, circles come together, circles explode. The teacher and myself, because I was very tied to him, we broke off from that circle due to backstabbing and the other things that can go on. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Sometimes being a public person or leading public ceremonies or public circles can lead to a certain level of scrutiny or judgment that perhaps other people may not come bear to, simply because you're out in the public. And let's be honest, not every person in public is going to like you. And not every person in public is going to agree with what you say. After Michael and I left that drumming circle, we started off in the basement of my house. And we had I think 4 of us at that point in time, and 2 people left, and Doug and Mike and I were wondering how we were going to continue the circle. And then on this, I kid you not, it really was a really cold night. I really don't know how these people found us, but they had just attended a Foundation for Shamanic Studies basic workshop, and we're looking for a place to practice. So we got an infusion. Literally that night, Mike and I were talking about, what do we do if nobody shows up? We're going to have to close the circle. We literally were talking about that like minutes before there was a knock on my door. So we started off with just us. And then from there, the circle grew again and started to grow again. my focus and my attention as leader of the circle, which was very different from Michael's, was number one, not this part, but was that I wanted each and every circle to have a lesson or an idea. And so from there, I think Mike didn't really like that because he was very much the person who, we had 2 journeys a night. There was one to the lower world and one to the upper world. And sometimes he would give us ideas, but most of the time it was just free journey work. So I came in and thought, well, this is crazy. I actually want to learn something. I want to get somewhere. So I started bringing in lesson plans. And I didn't have the internet. There was no, there really wasn't an internet available to many of us. So where I started was in the anthropology section and where do I get my inspiration from? So I would research some of the different ceremonies. So I was culturally expropriating shit all over the place before I got smart and understood, first of all, my own leanings with respect to my background of Finnish, and also understanding the how can I put it, the tastelessness of ceremony taken out of the context of a tradition or a group. Because there's a huge difference between, Patti, if you and I were raised in a traditional culture and we were raised as healers in that, we would have, and we were taught ceremonies for the moon, or we were taught ceremonies for women or for men, then we would have a context and all of the stories related to that. But if we just pluck that ceremony, that purification ceremony out, we have a vanilla flavored ceremony, whereas before we would have the enchiladas of all things. I know I just switched desserts to main meal, but you know what I'm talking about. So I wanted to know, Patti, one of the aspects of Patti is when I decided that I no longer was willing to be the caretaker of a drumming circle, because for me, I had been at it for 13 years. For I think 8 of those years, or maybe 7 of those years, it was every single Friday. And then it went to the first and third Fridays of the month because I found it overwhelming. What made you decide at that point that you would pick up the mantle and carry on the momentum of the drumming circle?
Well, to be honest, it wasn't anything I planned. When we were having that meeting, and you mentioned that you would be ceasing to run the circle and that you were throwing it open, this energy rose up in me. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't say no. For some reason, it's like, I need to do this. I don't know why. But then again, that's not dissimilar to how I came to shamanism as well. And that came as a surprise to me. I came to your circle. Some friends of mine had been attending for some months by that point, and they're like, oh, come, you're going to love it. So I went, and I'm like, yeah, it's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, and then you put out the call for the Psychopomp for the Indian Ocean tsunami. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, again, this energy rose in me and I felt compelled to go. And I attended that circle, and doing Psychopomp was the ticket for me.
Right.
That was the trigger that said, okay, I need to investigate this further. I need to study shamanism. So it was very similar in how it arose up. I had not consciously made the decision that, yes, I am going to step up and run shit.
Yeah, no, you hadn't. No.
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 Nope.
No. So that the calling came basically from being tapped from the other side.
Oh, totally.
Right. And for those that don't know, the word psychopomp means one who carries a soul. And it's associated with shamanism. And let's turn that term as being global shamanism or global spiritual practice, where it is the conductor of the soul. So the shaman plays the part, or is the part as the conductor of the soul. When we gather together in circle for psychopomp work, we are gathering as a unified group individual in our journeys, but a unified group as we journey en masse to a place of big destruction to see whether or not we can assist any of the dead souls to cross over to where they need to go. Oftentimes in tsunamis, earthquakes, mudslides, fires, where many people die at a time, there is loss, there is confusion, and souls get stuck behind. And those of us that are sensitive enough to experience ghosts or apparitions or the spirits of the unquiet dead, we know that it isn't always an easy transition from this realm to the next realm. So that is why Patti felt compelled to come. I think it was, curiosity, number one. And number two, it was a huge 250,000 people ultimately died. And your heart must have just been, I really need to help these people.
Oh, yeah. I was totally heartsick over just that immense loss. And again, not just the human loss. There's so many other spirit kin animal populations that were decimated in this process as well. And having seen some of them in the Psychopomp process, that makes an impression. So Spirit rose up and said, you need to step up. You need to take this on. The community needs to have a open drumming circle to be available for people to come and to learn.
And to practice.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that was very challenging for Patti at that point in time was that I had been renting a Buddhist temple, and we were meeting as a drumming circle in the Buddhist temple. What we also found out when I decided not to continue on with circle was that the Buddhist temple was closing and was no longer able to house the drumming circle. Now, before I go on to what you had to go through in order to get a space, I want to mention that in a large city, it may be different in smaller communities, but if you're interested in running a circle or running a drumming circle, if you want to keep your costs down, which is important to us in here, we needed to find someplace that was incredibly reasonable to rent, because renting a community hall can be anywhere from $200 to $300 just for 2 or 3 hours, not to mention what you have to pay for in order to carry insurance, because as of 2 years ago, you could no longer rent a community hall without buying a hefty amount of insurance. And that is very cost prohibitive. So now you're looking at, if you have, even if you had 20 people, at the cost of $300, you're looking at $40 per person. So that's a substantial commitment for something that lasts 2 or 2.5 hours. From my perspective, it's a financial commitment. So what did you have to do in order to find a spot that would keep the drumming circle running?
It took a lot of research and going around to visit different venues, finding out what kind of space they offered, what kind of access they had, both for transit, for parking, because our town is quite car dependent. So the mass transit isn't terribly appropriate for some of the off the beaten track locations that we found. Also, one of the important factors for me was that it was a wheelchair accessible and just an accessible space in general. And that was a primary consideration, because as much as I loved the energy of the old temple, it was anything but accessible.
You're right.
Steps up to get into the temple, steps both up and down to get back to the singular bathroom. And so it was important to me that there was more access for the population.
Right.
So it was a bunch of bantering back and forth, and then found a space that one of the other open circles in the city, not a shamanic circle, but one of the other open space circles was using, and they wanted $400 a night. And,
that's insane.
I began to despair, actually, that we were going to be able to have a space that was feasible.
Right.
Because just based on $400 a night for the space rental, there's no way on earth that was doable.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a bunch of months of telephoning and going around and different community halls and private spaces that were weird and not appropriate.
Yes. So, your advice then to others who would be interested in starting their own drumming circle would be to do some research to see whether or not the cost is bearable from a circle perspective or from a drop-in perspective.
Oh, completely. Like you again need to know whether it's accessible by mass transit.
Right.
If your community has mass transit, you need to know whether it's accessible for parking.
Right.
If you're working in a residential space, is it feasible if you're going to be taking up, 15 or 20 parking spaces on a residential street? How's that going to work out with your neighbors? And also, if you're in a multifamily dwelling, there's a lot of noise that is generated from a drumming circle.
Yes.
And one of the primary features for myself in setting up space and running a drumming circle is you need to be able to smudge. So you need to be able to burn plant material.
Right.
And, have that allowable. Again, that was one of the considerations when we were looking for space, because some of the prospective spaces were not willing to let us burn candles or
No, they're not.
or incense or smudge.
Yeah.
So we had to prove that the HVAC system could actually handle it at the space that we're in now.
Those are all very important considerations. The other consideration that we have to maintain, and the listeners would, if they're interested in their own drumming circle, is what would be the cost per person. And you and I have run drop-in circles, so we don't have you sign up for 10 months of the year, you pay a certain amount, and there's your spot. For you and I, the circles that we led and that other people lead are more for the people who decide on the moment whether or not they're able to come, or people who have budgeted in their time space, right? Because we all have, monetary considerations, we all have time constraints, we have all of these things.
Oh, exactly.
So it is, that is something that the person who may be considering operating or starting their own drumming circle to take into consideration. Are you going to do it from paying a one lump sum or have a drop in? And will that affect the cost that you have? For you and for I, the drumming circle was never really about making money.
No, it was never a money-making venture for me. I was compelled to provide a space for people to practice shamanism.
Yes.
That was, it wasn't about providing me an alternative income stream, which it certainly hasn't.
No.
But it was a need to provide this to the community.
And I echo that as well. It really, for me, the only thing I asked from Spirit was enough extra money left over for me to have the luxury of buying a coffee every day. And that was all I asked from Spirit. And that was most times all I got was extra money just for, coffee. There were all great nights where there were 40 people or 60 people at the circle, but those were not on a regular basis.
Oh, exactly. I mean, the volume would fluctuate. You'd have 4, 6, 8 people, and then some nights around special seasonal dates, you might get 25, 30, 40 people.
Right.
But those are the unusual circumstances. They're not the common. Mind you, then again, holding space for that many people is a very different factor than holding space for 8 people.
Exactly. You're very right.
Energetically holding space for that is very different.
It is very much. And it for me, it can be more tiring to hold space for 60 people as opposed to 14 people. There's a very different requirement in my physical body and the amount of fatigue that I may and or may not experience the next day. So these are all aspects of maintaining the circle. if you are intending, my dear listeners, if you are intending to start your own circle, one of the questions that you are going to ask yourself is, what am I doing this for? And for you and for me, it was really just to teach people. And I remember when I started the drumming circle, I felt like I was, to use the Christian metaphor, John the Baptist, the crier in the wilderness. I was constantly up talking the circle. Come, you're going to love it. You're just going to love it. Come and come. And I was emotionally invested in your spiritual development. You've got to come to the circle. Realizing now in hindsight, that was puppy dog enthusiasm, the eyes of the beginner, right? And second, partly my own ego. Not because it was working so well for me that it must also work for you.
But I think that's also part of the evolution that you need to go through in a leader of any kind.
Good point.
Right? Like, you have to, just because you have a particular enthusiasm and this particular technique or environment works for you, doesn't mean it works for everybody. But you're so excited about it, you have to share it.
Yeah, valid.
And then you get really invested with, but so-and-so said they were coming. Right? So it was a matter of years for me to work through that process, to be able to say, they chose not to come. That's fine.
Mm-hmm. How to detach and disengage from the expectation of whether or not a person that you care about and or do not care about shows up.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. It's, people are people and they have things that come up or they choose not to come, whatever. But it took me quite some time to detach my own ego from what somebody else's choices were.
Yes.
And so I think that's part of the learning curve regardless when you go into a leadership role.
Yes. That's true.
But speaking to the energy commitment,
right?
When you're leading if you choose to lead a space for a group of people, you have to be aware of the cost for you as a leader. Not the financial cost, but the energetic cost, the physical cost, because there are time commitments that you have to put in to create. I took a lead from and so I always have a topic for my circles. And so you've got to put planning time in for development. Plus, there's a certain amount of setup that you have to do before people get there.
Yes.
To create the space.
Yes.
And then you have to maintain the space. You're not just standing there in a drumming circle context, banging on a drum while people lay on the floor.
No.
You're responsible for these people.
Yes.
They're in your care.
Yes.
When they come to your drumming circle.
Yes.
So you're expending a certain energy. You're expecting your spirits to help you maintain that space. And the people who choose to attend, you're responsible for them. You need to look out for them.
Yeah.
And that has a cost to it.
Yes. Circle mates, regardless. I mean, we are in charge of our circle mates. Mm-hmm. We are responsible. We have that responsibility for whether or not someone in the circle is going to come back from a journey, or whether someone comes back disheveled or it comes back euphoric. Those are things that we have to take into consideration because those are the aspects that we watch for. As a conscientious circle leader, right? I've been to circles where that really isn't the conscious relationship between the leader and the people who are being led. I haven't, but I mean, everybody has a different way of doing it, and not every circle is shamanic. So
exactly.
There are many, many different ways of doing it. Now, in the aspect of maintaining a circle, you are fortunate enough to be in a time of Facebook, but Facebook with its algorithms and its hatred for the nonprofits or those who won't pay money, we are often left scrambling, just attempting to get the word out. So you do need a committed number of people within the circle parameters who will share around Facebook what you're doing or that a circle's coming up. What are some of the other ways that you rely on in order to build or maintain circle numbers?
Well, I have to admit, mostly relying on Facebook. It's been the tool that I've used. I do have an email for the drumming circle. However, I freely admit I'm terrible at checking it. For some reason, they're just checking it and sending out emails to remind people that there's a circle coming up just doesn't happen.
Right.
It's much easier to create a Facebook event.
Right.
I freely admit that. But I rely on, interpersonal relationships that I have with attendees of the circle and asking them to share. And I've had great support from the attendees that they're sharing out events and saying, hey, this is coming up. So that's been awesome. Plus word of mouth.
Right.
There's a metaphysical store in town that I've had my flyers at for the drumming circle with the drumming circle dates and a bit about the circle.
Oh, good.
One of the vendors, one of the pagan vendors in the city, when I give her flyers, she puts them in her local orders.
I like it.
So,
that's very handy.
Yeah, it's been great.
So there are different, so we have to find alternative ways of advertising, right?
Yes. Plus the space I rent is within a church and they have a bulletin board within the church and it's
a Unitarian church.
It's a Unitarian church, so it's quite open-minded, right?
Yeah.
Their population is quite diverse.
Yeah.
And I believe they have a pagan contingent component within their congregation. So I put the flyer up on their internal bulletin board, and I know that's brought in several people as well, but it also just keeps them apprised of what the dates are.
Exactly. And who's going to be in and who's not, so the choir doesn't make a lot of noise when you're setting up, sort of deal.
That's been entertaining a couple times. There's been a couple nights where there's been wires crossed with the booking, and I'll come in and there's balloons and tables set up for the wedding for Saturday because they had been told that they could come in and set up in advance.
Oh, I forgot. Oh, that must have been a friendly conversation.
It's happened several times.
Oh, my.
So, yes, that was tricky.
Very tricky.
I freely admit I wasn't particularly diplomatic.
Yeah, that's understandable.
But, yeah.
Yeah, but it's all part and parcel to the joys of running a public circle.
Well, exactly.
In a public space.
Renting a public space.
Right.
You have to deal with crossed wires.
You have to deal with crossed wires. Yes, I ran into that a couple of times in the temple as well. The other aspect is that Facebook wasn't around when I started. So, I had to rely on this lovely newsletter called The Moon Letter that was run by pagan-friendly individuals in the city of Edmonton.
I miss the Moon Letter.
I miss the Moon Letter too, but it seems that there are not as many of those particular types of events. But I mean, that was all by email, and that was also by printed Moon Letter. So it was actually a newsletter, and we don't have many of those printed materials around very much.
No.
Our electronic age has really moved. I did do, for 2 years in a row, advertising in a magazine called Mosaic Magazine, which is popular here in Edmonton, in Alberta, but it never netted me one person. So I found that the Moon Letter, which was circulated within the pagan community, was a tool to get some people, but most of the people who read the Moon Letter were practicing witches or Wicca, Wicca. I mean, and there's a big difference between witchcraft and Wicca. And there were Druids and Asaturs and other people who also utilized that Moon Letter. But I found over the years that the most effective tool for maintaining a drumming circle, number one, was consistency. And not that people remember the first and third Fridays of the month. How many times have you had to say that, right? When a circle.
First and third Fridays.
Right. And so
doors open at 6:30. Circle starts at 7.
It's been the mantra for so many years because I would say that and then passed on to you. So the maintaining of a regular event is very important.
Consistency is because people are so, they have stuff going on, right? So if they don't know that they can find this reliably, they're not going to make an effort.
No, they're not going to make an effort at all. And it is more challenging to find a one-off than it is to finding something that is something on a regular basis. And the other thing I find is that now in the beginning, there were two of you. There were yourself and another lovely lady named Erin. And that worked and didn't work. And then Erin extricated herself from the circle. She lived out of town and had other responsibilities placed upon her. Did you find that a challenge to going from a partnership to singular? I don't, from the effect of the amount of energy that you yourself would have to put into the everyday running of the circle.
Yes and no. It changed different aspects. I love brainstorming. I love talking spirit pretty much in any format. Anyway, so I love the back and forth discussion that we had about what we were going to be working with.
Yes.
So that was really stimulating for me personally. And yes, it became a little more tiring, or not even tiring, but it became more of an energy expenditure to maintain the energy of the space when it was me by myself. But also by that point too, there were several individuals who were regular attendees, and whether they realized it or not, they help hold space just by the nature of being experienced practitioners in their own right and being regular and knowing the drill. It helps hold down a foundational pillar, which makes it easier to run the circle. And that's something that I had observed when you were running circle, is that when there were more of us regulars, I found that we could hold space for a lot more newbies.
You're right. You're absolutely. And the other part that I could rely upon when I had a good solid group of people who supported me were that when the newcomers came in, it wasn't necessarily going to fall upon me to explain what exactly this weird thing they've just walked into comes. So you might explain to a newbie what's going on. Angel would explain what was going on. So there were other people who kept an eye out for newbies. And as a person who was leading, that was very helpful for me. That was very helpful. Now, what if one of the constant listeners or the semi-listeners or brand new listeners that we have today are not interested in creating a drumming circle that is a public event? What are some of the ways that you think that they could create their own sacred space in their own home that would be conducive to practicing shamanism by themselves?
Well, I, for the most part, live and breathe spirit work. I mean, you can appreciate that. That's how you function. So I have essentially set up my home as sacred space. So it doesn't take me a lot of effort to actually go into ceremony or go into journey.
Right.
Because the foundation is already around me.
Right.
For me personally, when I was setting up my own personal space, it's a matter of a candle, incense that I prefer, or smudge that I prefer, and saying prayers to the directions, calling in my spirits with prayers and percussion, whether that's drums or rattles,
right,
or even just my voice.
Right.
And then sitting down and doing the work. And never forgetting to say thank you when you're done.
Gratitude's right.
Because you're not alone.
No, we don't practice in a vacuum.
Yeah, because the spirits are there and they help you, whether you can consciously identify them or not. You know, I don't see a physical being sitting beside me in whatever form it may take. I don't see that.
Right.
But I do know my spirits are with me.
Right.
And I'm going to say thank you.
Right.
Because otherwise you're just bloody rude.
Yeah, very much so. And you're right. I think it is really very important for us to recognize and remember where the inspiration comes from, and that we are held sacred and safe in sacred space because we have spirits that show up. And one of the things I harp on is, if you call them, don't be surprised when they show up, right? So, like that people are always like, I hear this all the time. Oh my, whatever you want to insert, boss, Buddha, whatever you want, God, whatever you want to put in there. I didn't expect to be touched by something in my journey. I didn't expect to hear other sounds in my journey. I didn't, but it's like, well, but you asked them to join you. What did you think they were going to do? Sit on the other side of the room and, make funny faces at you that you can't see, right? So I think that there's that aspect. And for myself, too, it is a matter of calling in the directions. And it is usually a matter for me with respect to just using it from the using my rattle and my whistles if I'm very quiet about it, or like you, saying prayers off the cuff to each of the directions, opening that space. I think if you are a newer practitioner, one of the ways to continue to strengthen your bond with spirit is to have a similar practice or a practice that you can do over time, so that you become familiar with the change in energy or the change within yourself, even if you don't necessarily feel a change in the room. And I think that having a consistent practice is what opens our minds up to the changes that are occurring. I think that once we have that practice ingrained in us and that recognition of the differences in spirit or differences in energy, that perhaps you can go a bit more off script. Now, there are many people who are impromptu spirit workers. There are many people who just do it if it feels right. And that's a whole other podcast, one I'm not going to get into here. But I really think it's important from my perspective, also like you, to light the candle. And that for me came from a journey where I was in trouble in the journey. And the fact that I had a candle lit in the room created a fire in the spirit world, which created a beacon for me to get out of where I was. And ever since that time, I've never journeyed without a candle going, because for me, it is that one sure way, from a psychological protection perspective, that I'm always going to get home. So, and one of the things in working within my own home, like I do, with the number of people coming through my home that I don't have to call in the directions every day, because I don't, they're always here because I continually work. Now, one of the other things you talk about is saying prayers and gratitudes in order to close off the space. The other thing that we do, I know in Circle and I do at home, if I am deliberately closing my space, is I sing a song that I create, or in my mind works as a bridge or a way from this world to that world. So that whatever spirits I've called in, instead of saying, okay, now I'm done with you, see you later, bye, right? Which I think is rude personally. But that's because I was told it was rude. It doesn't mean it's rude for you, but it is rude for me.
Every path has its own truths.
Exactly. So for me, I had to come up with an alternative. So singing the spirits home for me felt more natural and more authentic than saying we are kith and we are kin, blessed be, see you later, bye. Sort of deal, right?
Ciao, I'm out.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. Don't forget to pay on the way out the door, sort of a deal. So I wanted to say thank you, Patti, for sharing your time with myself and with my constant listeners, my semi-listeners, and my brand new listeners. And I wanted to thank you for sharing your wisdom. I've had a delightful talk with you. The time flew by much quicker than I thought it did.
Well, thank you ever so much. I'm really honored that you asked me to come on. And yeah, I thoroughly enjoy our conversations when we talk spirit. At any point, it just so happens we had a mic between us this time.
Just this time. So to my constant listeners, to my semi-listeners, and to my brand new listeners, thank you for tuning into Shaman's Way once again. And I look forward to spending time with you in the near future. In the meantime, have a lovely day. Have a great rest of whatever this is, time, space for you. And until the next time. I wish you many blessings.
Thank you again for joining us here on the Shaman's Way podcast. If you have any questions, would like to make a request for a future episode, or if you're looking for other shamanic resources, including free drumming tracks, please visit us at shamansway.net. Until the next episode, be well, everyone.